The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors where Catherine once danced freely with her children. She stood motionless now, watching Prince George carefully arrange his toy soldiers in perfect formation on the Persian rug. Each miniature figure was placed with the same precision that would soon govern every aspect of his own life. Catherine's fingers traced the edge of her wedding ring, a simple gesture that had become a daily reminder of how drastically her world had shifted. The weight of the sapphire engagement ring felt heavier now, not because of the precious stone itself, but because of everything it represented. She was no longer just Kate Middleton, the girl from Berkshire who could slip into a pub unnoticed or grab groceries without a security detail. She was Catherine, Princess of Wales, and with that title came an invisible cage built from centuries of tradition and expectation. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the gradual change of seasons. First, there were the subtle suggestions from palace staff about appropriate behavior. Then came the formal protocols that needed to be observed. Eventually, these guidelines became as natural as breathing, yet they felt suffocating at times. William entered the room quietly, his presence immediately filling the space with both comfort and the unspoken weight of duty. He had been born into this life, raised to understand that personal desires often came second to royal obligations. For Catherine, it was a lesson learned through experience, each restriction a small sacrifice on the altar of service. "The children's schedule has been adjusted again," William said softly, settling beside her on the window seat. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent the morning in meetings about state functions, charitable obligations, and the careful choreography of public appearances. Catherine nodded, understanding the implications without need for explanation. George's carefree childhood was slowly being shaped by the demands of his future role. Charlotte and Louis would follow similar paths, their innocent laughter gradually tempered by the weight of expectation. The spontaneous family outings that once brought such joy were becoming increasingly rare, replaced by carefully planned public engagements that served multiple diplomatic purposes. She remembered the early days of their relationship when they could escape to the mountains of Scotland or find quiet corners in London where nobody recognized them. Those stolen moments of normalcy seemed like treasures from another lifetime. Now, even their private family time was subject to security briefings and schedule approvals. The irony wasn't lost on her that in becoming a princess, she had gained the world's attention, but lost many simple pleasures that most people took for granted. Shopping for her children's clothes had become a diplomatic consideration, each outfit photographed and analyzed by fashion experts and royal watchers. A casual comment to a friend could become headline news. Even her facial expressions during public events were scrutinized and interpreted as political statements. George looked up from his toys, his young face bright with innocence that Catherine desperately wanted to preserve. "Mummy, can we go to the park today? Just us." The question pierced through Catherine's carefully maintained composure. How do you explain to a child that a simple trip to the playground requires security assessments, crowd control measures, and media management? How do you tell your son that his presence anywhere creates a spectacle that transforms ordinary places into stages for public consumption? "We'll see, darling," she replied, the phrase that had become her diplomatic way of managing expectations while avoiding outright disappointment. William's hand found hers, a small gesture of understanding that spoke volumes about their shared struggle to balance family life with public duty. Later that afternoon, Catherine found herself in the palace gardens, walking alone among the roses that had been carefully cultivated for generations. The flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry, each bush maintained according to traditions established long before her birth. Like everything else in her new life, even the gardens followed rules that couldn't be broken. She paused beside a bench where she often sat with her grandmother-in-law, the late Queen Elizabeth, during those precious moments when the monarch would share stories about the challenges of royal life. The Queen's words echoed in Catherine's memory. "The crown is both a privilege and a burden, my dear. It requires us to give up much of ourselves for the greater good." Those conversations had prepared Catherine intellectually for the sacrifices required. But no amount of preparation could fully shield her from the emotional reality of watching her children's freedom slowly diminish. Each year brought new protocols, additional security measures, and fewer opportunities for the kind of spontaneous joy that should define childhood. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path announced the approach of her private secretary, whose presence meant that her brief moment of solitude was about to end. The schedule was relentless, filled with charitable appearances, state dinners, and cultural events that served important diplomatic purposes, but left little time for the quiet family moments she treasured. "Your Royal Highness, the car is ready for the hospital visit," the secretary announced with practiced efficiency. Catherine straightened her shoulders, the physical gesture that had become her way of transitioning from private person to public figure. The mask of composure settled over her features, hiding the internal struggle between duty and desire. As she walked toward the waiting car, Catherine caught a glimpse of Charlotte and Louis playing in the distance, their laughter carried on the afternoon breeze. Their security detail maintained a discreet distance, but their presence served as a constant reminder that even childhood games were now matters of national security. The drive through London provided a temporary refuge, the tinted windows creating a barrier between Catherine and the crowds who gathered whenever her schedule was announced. She watched ordinary families walking together without entourages, children running freely without consideration for public image or security protocols. The sight filled her with both longing and gratitude, longing for the simplicity they enjoyed and gratitude for the meaningful work her position allowed her to accomplish. At the Children's Hospital, Catherine's training took over. She moved through the wards with genuine warmth and compassion, her interactions with young patients and their families authentic despite the cameras that recorded every moment. This was the part of her role that made the sacrifices worthwhile, the ability to bring comfort to those facing unimaginable challenges, to use her platform to highlight important causes and create positive change. A young girl, no older than Charlotte, reached out to touch Catherine's hand. The child's eyes were bright despite her illness, filled with the kind of hope that reminded Catherine why her work mattered. In that moment, the restrictions and protocols faded into the background, replaced by the profound privilege of making a difference in someone else's life. But even these meaningful encounters were bound by rules. Time limits were strictly observed, conversations were carefully monitored for potential misinterpretation, and every interaction was filtered through layers of protocol designed to protect both the royal family and the public. The spontaneous human connections that she craved were precious, but brief, like flowers that bloomed beautifully, but only for a moment. The evening return to the palace brought Catherine back to the reality of her transformed existence. The children were already in their bedtime routines, supervised by nannies whose discretion had been thoroughly vetted. Even the most intimate family moments were touched by the awareness that their lives were subjects of intense public interest and scrutiny. As Catherine prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw not just a mother and wife, but a symbol that belonged to the nation. Her reflection showed someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity and grace under pressure, but also someone who sometimes missed the freedom to make mistakes, to have bad days, to be imperfect without consequence. The transformation from Kate to Catherine had been gradual but complete. She had gained purpose, influence, and the ability to serve causes greater than herself. But she had also lost the luxury of privacy, the freedom to make spontaneous decisions, and the simple pleasure of blending into a crowd. The rules that governed her life were different now, shaped by centuries of tradition and the expectations of a nation that looked to the royal family for stability and inspiration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more appearances, and additional responsibilities. Catherine would meet them with the strength and dignity that had become her hallmarks, even as a part of her continued to mourn the simpler life that duty had required her to leave behind. The crown was indeed both privilege and burden, and she was learning to carry both with equal grace. In the quiet of her private moments, Catherine allowed herself to acknowledge the complexity of her feelings. She was proud of the work she was able to accomplish, grateful for the platform to make a positive difference, and deeply committed to the institution she had married into. But she was also human, with desires and dreams that sometimes conflicted with the expectations placed upon her. The rules were different now, and Catherine was still learning how to live within their boundaries while maintaining the essence of who she was meant to be. It was a delicate balance that would define not only her own future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The morning light barely touched the edges of the curtains when Catherine found herself wide awake, her mind already racing through the day's obligations. Sleep had become an elusive companion since the weight of her royal duties had intensified. Where once she could sleep deeply and wake naturally, now her internal clock was perpetually aligned with schedules planned months in advance by palace staff who understood the intricate dance of royal protocol better than she ever would. William was already gone, having left before dawn for an environmental summit that would keep him away for 3 days. His absence meant that Catherine would shoulder the full responsibility of maintaining normalcy for their children while navigating her own packed schedule. The loneliness of royal duty was something she was still learning to manage. The way important decisions had to be made in isolation, how personal struggles couldn't be shared with friends who might inadvertently reveal private information to the press. As she made her way to the children's wing of their residence, Catherine passed the formal portraits of William's ancestors that lined the corridor walls. Each face looked down with the same expression of dutiful composure that she was learning to wear like armor. These were people who had sacrificed personal happiness for the greater good of the nation, and their silent presence served as a constant reminder of the legacy she was now part of preserving. George was already dressed in his school uniform, the crisp lines and perfect creases a stark contrast to the rumpled pajamas and messy hair of ordinary children his age. Even his casual clothes were selected with care, each outfit photographed and analyzed by fashion commentators who treated an 8-year-old's wardrobe choices as matters of national significance. Catherine's heart ached as she watched him struggle with his tie, his small fingers working to achieve the perfection that was expected of him even at such a tender age. "Let me help you with that, sweetheart," Catherine offered, kneeling to adjust his collar with practiced efficiency. The simple intimacy of the gesture felt precious precisely because it was becoming increasingly rare. Soon, George would have his own valet, someone trained specifically to ensure that the future king's appearance always met the exacting standards required by his position. Charlotte bounced into the room with the kind of energy that Catherine remembered from her own childhood. Uninhibited, joyful, and completely unaware of the cameras that would capture her every public moment for the rest of her life. The little princess had inherited Catherine's love of movement and play, but even her activities were becoming subject to scrutiny and scheduling. Her gymnastics lessons had been moved to a private facility after photographers attempted to capture images through the windows of the local community center where she had originally enrolled. "Mummy, can we have a proper tea party today? With real cups and everything?" Charlotte asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. The request was innocent enough, but Catherine immediately began calculating the logistics. Could they manage an hour of uninterrupted family time? Would security need to sweep the garden first? Were there any official photographs scheduled that might require her to maintain a particular appearance throughout the day? The internal negotiations that now preceded every family activity exhausted Catherine more than any public engagement ever could. She longed for the days when a tea party simply required gathering cups from the kitchen and spreading a blanket on the grass. Now, even the most basic family traditions required coordination with multiple departments and consideration of security protocols. Louis, still young enough to be largely oblivious to the changes surrounding their family, climbed onto Catherine's lap with the unconscious confidence of a child who trusted that his world would always be safe and predictable. His weight in her arms provided an anchor of authenticity in a life that often felt scripted and performative. She breathed in his familiar scent and tried to memorize the feeling of his complete trust and dependence. The morning routine proceeded with clockwork precision, each family member moving through their assigned roles in the choreographed dance of royal domestic life. Breakfast was served by staff members who had been with the royal household for decades, their presence both comforting and constraining. Catherine missed the chaos of preparing meals herself, the satisfied exhaustion of cooking for her family, the casual intimacy of sharing simple meals without formal place settings and prescribed conversation topics. After the children departed for school with their security details, Catherine faced the prospect of her own day's obligations. Her private secretary presented a revised schedule that included additional appearances to replace events that William would miss during his travels. The flexibility required of royal spouses was something Catherine was still adjusting to, the way her own identity and commitments were constantly shifting to accommodate the demands of William's role as heir to the throne. Her first stop was a new community center in East London, where she would officially open the facility and meet with local residents who had been instrumental in its development. The drive through the city allowed Catherine to observe ordinary people living their ordinary lives, and she found herself particularly drawn to young mothers pushing strollers along busy sidewalks. They moved with a freedom that she could barely remember, able to change directions on impulse, stop at unexpected shops, or sit on park benches without consideration for security perimeters. At the community center, Catherine threw herself into her work with a passionate commitment that had become her trademark. She spoke with teenage mothers who were completing their education despite overwhelming challenges, elderly residents who had volunteered countless hours to make the center a reality, and children who saw the new facility as a place where their dreams might take shape. These conversations energized Catherine in ways that formal state dinners never could, reminding her that her platform could be used to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. But even these meaningful interactions were bounded by invisible walls. She couldn't exchange contact information with the people who moved her most deeply, couldn't follow up personally on their stories, couldn't develop the kind of ongoing relationships that might have made her feel more connected to the community she served. Her role was to inspire and encourage, to bring attention and resources, but not to become personally involved in ways that might compromise her position or create conflicts of interest. During the car ride to her next appointment, Catherine allowed herself a moment of vulnerability that she couldn't show in public. She closed her eyes and imagined what it would be like to stay at the community center for the entire day, to help with the actual work rather than simply observing and commenting. She pictured herself organizing supplies, serving meals, or tutoring children, activities that would provide the kind of direct satisfaction that ceremonial appearances couldn't offer. The afternoon brought her to a primary school where she would launch a new literacy initiative. As she watched children reading aloud with obvious pride in their accomplishment, Catherine was reminded of her own children's love of stories and learning. But even this joyful experience was tinged with sadness as she realized how different her own children's educational journey would be. George would never experience the democratic chaos of a typical classroom, never develop friendships based purely on shared interests rather than diplomatic considerations. Between official engagements, Catherine found herself thinking about the small freedoms that most people took for granted. She missed grocery shopping, comparing prices, and selecting items based on family preferences rather than having meals planned by professional staff. She missed the satisfaction of completing household tasks herself, the simple accomplishment of organizing a closet or planning a birthday party without delegating every detail to assistants. The weight of constant observation had changed even her most private behaviors. She was always aware that her posture, expressions, and reactions might be photographed and analyzed. The natural spontaneity that had once characterized her interactions had been replaced by a careful consideration of how every gesture might be interpreted. Even her genuine emotions had to be filtered through an awareness of their potential public impact. As evening approached, Catherine returned home to find the children already deep in their homework routines. Their studious concentration reminded her of how their lives were being shaped by expectations that extended far beyond normal academic achievement. They were learning not just mathematics and literature, but also the subtle arts of public speaking, diplomatic conversation, and emotional self-regulation under scrutiny. Dinner time without William felt particularly hollow. The empty chair at the head of the table serving as a reminder of how often duty would separate their family. Catherine tried to fill the silence with light-hearted conversation, but she could see that the children also felt the absence of their father's stabilizing presence. The burden of maintaining family normalcy while managing public obligations was one that she often carried alone, and the isolation of that responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming. After putting the children to bed, Catherine finally allowed herself to confront the full emotional weight of her transformed existence. She stood in her private sitting room, surrounded by photographs of happier, simpler times, and acknowledged the grief she felt for the life she had given up. It wasn't that she regretted her choices, but rather that she was still learning how to mourn what had been lost while embracing what had been gained. The phone calls from old friends had become less frequent as the distance created by protocol and security made spontaneous connection nearly impossible. Social gatherings now required advanced planning, background checks, and careful consideration of potential diplomatic implications. The easy intimacy of longtime friendships had been replaced by more formal interactions that protected both Catherine's position and her friends' privacy. Her relationship with her own family had also evolved in ways that sometimes felt painful. Her parents and siblings had to navigate new protocols when visiting, and even their private family celebrations were subject to security considerations and media management. The natural give and take of family dynamics had been replaced by a more cautious approach that recognized Catherine's unique position and the responsibilities that came with it. As she prepared for bed, Catherine reflected on how profoundly her daily reality had changed. The simple pleasure of choosing her own clothes had been replaced by consultations with stylists who understood the diplomatic implications of fashion choices. Her reading material was often selected based on upcoming engagements rather than personal interest. Even her exercise routine was planned around security requirements and schedule constraints. Yet amid all these losses, Catherine was beginning to recognize the unique gifts that her position offered. She had access to remarkable people working on important causes around the world. Her voice could bring attention to issues that desperately needed public awareness. Her presence could comfort people facing their darkest moments and celebrate those achieving their greatest triumphs. The challenge was learning to hold both realities simultaneously, acknowledging what had been sacrificed while embracing what had been gained. Catherine was discovering that the most difficult aspect of royal life wasn't the public scrutiny or demanding schedule, but rather the ongoing process of redefining herself within the constraints of her new role while maintaining the essential core of who she had always been. The rules were different now, and Catherine was beginning to understand that adapting to them would be a lifelong journey rather than a destination. Each day brought new lessons about balancing personal desires with public duty, family needs with national expectations, authentic emotion with diplomatic necessity. It was a complex navigation that required both strength and flexibility, courage and compassion, confidence and humility. As sleep finally began to claim her, Catherine found peace in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to make a positive difference, and new moments of connection that would remind her why the sacrifices were worthwhile. The transformation from Kate to Catherine was ongoing, and she was learning to trust that she could honor both versions of herself as she continued to grow into her extraordinary role. The autumn morning brought an unexpected chill to Windsor, and Catherine found herself standing at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers prepare the estate's gardens for the changing season. Each tree was carefully tended, each path meticulously maintained, every element of the landscape serving the dual purpose of beauty and security. Like everything else in her world now, even nature was subject to protocols and planning that stretched far beyond the immediate needs of the moment. 6 months had passed since William's increased responsibilities following his father's health concerns had thrust their family into an even more prominent role. The transition had been swift and jarring, leaving Catherine to navigate waters that seemed to deepen daily. What had once felt like preparation for a distant future had suddenly become urgent present reality, and the weight of that transformation pressed upon her shoulders like an invisible crown that grew heavier each day. The children's lives had been affected most dramatically by these changes. George's schedule now included regular meetings with constitutional scholars who would prepare him for his eventual role. At 9 years old, he was learning about parliamentary procedure and Commonwealth relations alongside his multiplication tables. Catherine watched her eldest child transform before her eyes, his natural curiosity about the world being channeled into increasingly formal educational frameworks that left little room for the wonder and exploration that should define childhood. Charlotte had begun asking questions that pierced straight to the heart of Catherine's own struggles. "Why can't we just be a normal family, Mummy?" she had inquired just the previous week, her young face serious with a concern that no 7-year-old should have to carry. "How do you explain to your daughter that normalcy was a luxury their family had surrendered in service to something larger than themselves? How do you help a child understand that her spontaneous laughter and uninhibited play were precious gifts that would gradually be shaped by expectations she couldn't yet comprehend?" Lewis, still blissfully unaware of the full implications of his birthright, continued to approach the world with the fearless enthusiasm of a toddler. His innocent demands for attention and affection serve as daily reminders of what Catherine was fighting to preserve, the essential humanity that could so easily be lost amid the formality and protocol that increasingly governed their lives. The morning's briefing with Catherine's expanded staff revealed the true scope of how dramatically her role had evolved. Where once she had managed a handful of charitable patronages and made occasional public appearances, she now found herself responsible for representing the monarchy at state functions, international diplomatic events, and cultural celebrations that carried significant political weight. Each appearance required extensive preparation, from briefings on historical context to coaching on appropriate responses to sensitive political questions. Her private secretary, a woman whose competence Catherine deeply respected, but whose constant presence reminded her of how little privacy remained in her life, presented a schedule that stretched months into the future. Every hour was accounted for, every appearance carefully calibrated to serve multiple diplomatic and charitable purposes. The spontaneity that had once brought joy to Catherine's days had been replaced by a precision that left no room for impulse or unexpected opportunity. "The Commonwealth tour has been confirmed for next spring," her secretary announced, her voice carrying the efficiency that characterized all palace communications. 6 countries over 3 weeks, with a focus on environmental initiatives and youth development programs. Catherine nodded, understanding both the honor and the burden of such an assignment. These tours were crucial for maintaining the Commonwealth relationships that formed a cornerstone of modern monarchy, but they also meant weeks away from her children during some of their most formative years. The guilt of missing school plays, birthday parties, and bedtime stories for the sake of diplomatic necessity was something Catherine was still learning to manage. The irony of her situation struck her regularly and forcefully. In becoming a global advocate for children's welfare and family support, she was required to spend increasingly long periods away from her own children and family. The work was meaningful and important, addressing issues that affected millions of families around the world, but the personal cost was something that few people understood or acknowledged. Her afternoon was dedicated to a cause that had become particularly close to her heart: supporting families affected by domestic violence. The shelter she visited had been established through funding that her patronage had helped secure, and seeing the concrete impact of her advocacy provided some comfort for the sacrifices her role required. She listened to stories of survival and recovery, offered encouragement to children who were rebuilding their sense of safety, and witnessed firsthand how privilege could be transformed into purpose. But even these deeply meaningful encounters were filtered through layers of protocol that sometimes felt suffocating. She couldn't share personal details that might have deepened her connection with the women and children she met. She couldn't make promises for ongoing support that weren't first approved through official channels. Her genuine desire to help was constrained by institutional requirements that protected both the monarchy and the people she served, but that also created distance precisely when human connection was most needed. The drive back to Windsor provided Catherine with rare moments of solitude, though even these were shared with security personnel whose constant presence had become so routine that she sometimes forgot they were there. Through the car windows, she observed families walking together without entourages, couples holding hands without concern for public perception, children playing in parks without security assessments or media management. The ordinary freedom of these strangers filled her with a complex mixture of longing and gratitude that she was still learning to navigate. Evening brought the family together around the dinner table, though William's place remained empty due to a state visit that would keep him away for another week. Catherine had become skilled at maintaining cheerful conversation that distracted the children from the frequent absences that duty required, but privately, she struggled with the isolation of carrying both parental and royal responsibilities without the support of her partner. George shared news about his history lessons with the enthusiasm that reminded Catherine of William's own childhood passion for learning about their family's role in British history. But she also noticed how her son's questions were becoming more sophisticated, more aware of the weight of expectation that would eventually settle on his shoulders. He was losing the simple joy of learning for its own sake, and Catherine felt powerless to prevent this premature maturation that seemed inevitable given his birthright. Charlotte's contribution to the dinner conversation revealed her growing awareness of public attention and scrutiny. She mentioned classmates who had seen photographs of their family in magazines and newspapers, and Catherine could see her daughter beginning to understand that their lives were subjects of public consumption. The protective instincts that this realization triggered in Catherine were intense and sometimes overwhelming, but there was little she could do to shield her children from a reality that was fundamental to their existence. After the children were settled for the night, Catherine found herself in the private sitting room that had become her sanctuary within the larger institutional framework of royal residences. The space was filled with personal photographs and mementos that reminded her of life before titles and protocol, but even these treasured objects served as painful reminders of how much had changed. The letters and messages from well-wishers that arrived daily in enormous volumes testified to the positive impact of her work, but they also highlighted the strange paradox of her position. People around the world felt they knew her intimately through media coverage and public appearances, yet her actual daily experience was increasingly isolated from normal human connection. She was simultaneously one of the most recognized women in the world and one of the loneliest, surrounded by people, but unable to form the kind of spontaneous friendships that had once nourished her spirit. Her relationship with technology had also been fundamentally altered by her position. Social media, which had once provided connection and entertainment, was now completely off limits due to security concerns and the potential for misinterpretation. Email communication was monitored and filtered through palace systems. Even phone calls to family and friend were subject to security protocols that made spontaneous conversation nearly impossible. The simple pleasure of reading for entertainment had been replaced by studying briefing documents and background materials for upcoming engagements. Her personal interests in photography and art had been transformed into official patronages that served important cultural purposes but left little room for private creative exploration. Even her exercise routine was dictated by security requirements and scheduling constraints that made the physical activity feel more like another obligation than a personal release. Catherine had begun keeping a private journal, writing in careful code about her feelings and experiences in case the document was ever discovered and made public. The inability to express herself freely, even in private writing, represented one of the most painful losses of her transformation. The spontaneous authenticity that had once characterized her communication with others had been replaced by careful consideration of potential interpretation and consequences. Sleep had become increasingly elusive as the weight of responsibility and isolation pressed upon her consciousness. Even in dreams, she found herself navigating complex social situations where every word and gesture carried diplomatic significance. The rest that sleep was supposed to provide was often disrupted by anxiety about upcoming appearances or guilt about time away from her children. Yet within these challenges, Catherine was beginning to discover wells of strength and resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. The demands of her role were teaching her to find meaning in service, to locate purpose in sacrifice, and to understand that personal fulfillment might look very different from what she had once imagined. The women and children she met through her charitable work inspired her with their courage and determination, reminding her that her own struggles, while real and valid, were also opportunities to develop the empathy and understanding that would make her advocacy more authentic and effective. She was learning to measure success not by personal happiness or freedom, but by the positive changes that her work could create in the lives of others. The platform that her position provided was unprecedented in its reach and influence, and Catherine was beginning to understand how that privilege could be transformed into lasting social good. The transformation from Kate to Catherine was ongoing and often painful, but it was also revealing capacities for leadership and compassion that might never have been developed under different circumstances. The rules were different now, and learning to live within them while maintaining her essential humanity was perhaps the greatest challenge and the most important contribution she could make to the institution she had married into and the people she served. As the evening deepened into night, Catherine allowed herself to acknowledge both the losses and gains of her extraordinary life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, fresh chances to serve and sacrifice, additional lessons in balancing personal needs with public duty. The journey of becoming worthy of the trust that had been placed in her was far from complete, but Catherine was beginning to believe that she might be equal to the task, even as it continued to transform her in ways she was still learning to understand. The first anniversary of Catherine's expanded role arrived with a quiet dignity that marked all significant royal occasions. There were no public celebrations, no official acknowledgments of the personal transformation that had taken place over the previous 12 months. Yet as Catherine stood in the same window where this story had begun, watching the early morning light illuminate the grounds of their estate, she was acutely aware of how profoundly she had changed during this period of intense growth and adaptation. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror bore little resemblance to the Kate Middleton who had once worried about fitting into royal life. The uncertainty and frequent anxiety that had characterized her early years as a duchess had been replaced by a quiet confidence that came from surviving challenges she couldn't have imagined when she first accepted William's proposal. The rules had indeed been different, more demanding, and more transformative than she had understood, but she had learned not only to live within them, but to find purpose and strength in their constraints. The children had adapted to their evolving circumstances with a remarkable resilience that seemed to characterize each generation of the royal family. George had grown into his increased responsibilities with a seriousness that sometimes concerned Catherine, but also filled her with pride. His understanding of his future role was maturing alongside his character, and she could see glimpses of the king he would one day become in his thoughtful responses to the situations they encountered together. Charlotte had found her own way of navigating the public attention, developing a charm and confidence that reminded Catherine of William's own childhood ability to balance protocol with personality. Her daughter's questions about their family's role had become more sophisticated and less accusatory, reflecting a growing understanding of the service aspect of their position rather than simply the restrictions it imposed. Lewis remained the family's anchor to normalcy, his uninhibited joy and natural mischief serving as daily reminders that childhood could still flourish within the confines of royal life. His presence kept Catherine connected to the simple pleasures of parenting that transcended any institutional requirements or public expectations. Watching him discover the world with wonder and excitement reinforced her determination to preserve as much childhood magic as possible for all her children. William's return from his latest international assignment brought a stability to family life that Catherine had learned not to take for granted. Their partnership had deepened through the challenges of the past year, their mutual understanding of the sacrifices required by their position, creating an intimacy that was perhaps only possible between people who shared such extraordinary circumstances. They had learned to communicate in the shorthand of couples who must navigate both personal and public responsibilities, finding moments of connection amid schedules that often pulled them in different directions. The breakfast conversation that morning centered around plans for the summer holidays, a discussion that illustrated how completely their family life had been transformed by royal requirements. What had once been simple decisions about where to spend vacation time now involved complex negotiations between security needs, diplomatic opportunities, and the children's educational schedules. Even their most private family time was subject to considerations that most families never had to contemplate. "The Scottish estate has been prepared for our visit," William mentioned casually, though Catherine understood the weeks of planning that such preparation involved. Staff coordination, security assessments, and local community preparation were required before the royal family could enjoy even a few weeks of relative privacy in the countryside. The spontaneous family trips that had once brought such joy were now impossibly complicated, replaced by carefully orchestrated retreats that served multiple purposes beyond simple relaxation. Catherine's morning briefing revealed the scope of work that lay ahead in the coming months. International visits had been planned that would take her to countries where her presence could strengthen diplomatic relationships while highlighting causes that were central to her advocacy work. Each trip represented an opportunity to make a meaningful difference in addressing global challenges, but also meant additional time away from her children during crucial developmental periods. The balance between public service and family responsibility remained Catherine's greatest ongoing challenge. She had learned to measure time differently, to value moments of connection more intensely because they were increasingly precious. Family dinners, bedtime stories, and quiet conversations had become treasures to be savored rather than routine experiences to be taken for granted. Her work with early childhood development had evolved into a comprehensive initiative that was beginning to show measurable impact in communities across the Commonwealth. The research she had commissioned was influencing policy decisions. The programs she had supported were reaching thousands of families, and the awareness she had raised was creating lasting changes in how society approached the crucial early years of human development. This tangible progress provided Catherine with deep satisfaction and justified the personal sacrifices that her role required. The letters and messages that arrived from people whose lives had been touched by her work offered Catherine glimpses into the real-world impact of her advocacy. Teachers reported improved resources for early learning programs, parents shared stories of support during difficult times, and children sent drawings that captured their hopes and dreams with the innocent optimism that Catherine was fighting to protect and nurture. These communications reminded her that the protocols and restrictions that sometimes felt suffocating were actually frameworks that allowed her to reach and help people she would never have been able to assist as a private citizen. Her relationship with the media had evolved into a complex dance of cooperation and boundaries. Catherine had learned to use public attention as a tool for highlighting important causes while maintaining the privacy necessary to protect her family's well-being. The photographers and journalists who followed her every public move had become a routine part of her environment, their presence as predictable as the weather and often as challenging to navigate. The fashion attention that accompanied Catherine's public appearances had initially felt trivial and distracting, but she had learned to view her clothing choices as another form of communication. Supporting British designers, choosing sustainable fashion options, and sending subtle messages through sartorial choices had become part of her toolkit for advocacy and diplomacy. Even something as personal as getting dressed had become a calculated decision with potential international implications. Her private moments of reflection often centered on the woman she had become through this transformation. The Kate who had worried about curtsying correctly and choosing appropriate conversation topics had evolved into Catherine, who could engage with world leaders, comfort grieving families, and inspire audiences across cultures and continents. The confidence that had emerged from surviving constant scrutiny and exceeding expectations was hard-won, but genuine, rooted in experience rather than pretense. The friendships that had survived her transformation were precious precisely because they had adapted to her changed circumstances. The people who remained close to Catherine were those who could accept the protocols and restrictions without taking them personally, who understood that her loyalty and affection were unchanged even when her availability was limited. These relationships required more effort to maintain, but provided essential grounding in her pre-royal identity. The loneliness that Catherine had initially feared would define her royal life had been replaced by a different kind of solitude, one that came from understanding that her experiences were unique and couldn't be fully shared even with those closest to her. But within that solitude, she had discovered reserves of strength and wisdom that she was learning to trust. The isolation that had once felt like punishment had become a space for reflection and growth. Her daily routine had settled into rhythms that honored both institutional requirements and personal needs. Early morning exercise provided physical release and mental clarity before the day's obligations began. Time with the children was fiercely protected and deliberately unstructured when possible. Evenings often included reading briefing materials and preparing for upcoming engagements, but Catherine had learned to create boundaries that preserved some space for personal interests and relaxation. The recognition that came with her position had taught Catherine to value different forms of achievement and fulfillment. The applause and admiration of public audiences was gratifying, but the quiet moments when her work made a tangible difference in someone's life provided deeper satisfaction. She had learned to measure success not by personal happiness or freedom, but by the positive changes that her advocacy could create and the example she could set for her children and other young women. As the evening approached, Catherine found herself back at the window, where she often stood to process the complexities of her transformed life. The view remained the same, carefully maintained grounds stretching toward ancient trees that had sheltered generations of her husband's family. But her perspective on that view had been fundamentally altered by everything she had learned and experienced during her year of intensive growth. The rules were indeed different now, more complex and demanding than she had initially understood. But Catherine had discovered that those rules, rather than simply constraining her, had also revealed capacities and capabilities that might never have emerged under different circumstances. The woman she had become, through adapting to royal life, was stronger, more compassionate, more effective at creating positive change than the woman she had been before accepting this extraordinary responsibility. Her children's laughter from the garden below reminded Catherine of what was most important to preserve and protect through all the protocols and obligations. Their ability to find joy within the constraints of their unique circumstances, their developing understanding of service and sacrifice, and Their growing awareness of the privilege and responsibility that came with their positions were perhaps her greatest achievements as both a mother and a royal family member. The transformation from Kate to Catherine was complete in some ways, but would continue evolving for the rest of her life. Each new challenge would require fresh adaptation. Each opportunity would demand continued growth, and each year would bring deeper understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than herself. The rules would continue to be different, but Catherine had learned that working within those constraints could lead to a form of freedom that was perhaps more meaningful than any she had previously known. As nights settled over the estate, Catherine felt a peace that had been hard-won through months of struggle and adaptation. She had found her place within an institution that was both ancient and evolving, had learned to balance personal needs with public duty, and had discovered that the sacrifices required by her role could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Catherine faced them with the confidence of someone who had not only survived transformation, but had been elevated by it. The rules were different now, and Catherine had learned not only to live with them, but to thrive within their framework, creating a legacy of service and advocacy that would long outlast any temporary restrictions or personal sacrifices. In losing one version of herself, she had discovered another that was perhaps more capable of making the kind of difference in the world that would justify all the complications and constraints of her extraordinary life.